Good afternoon, everyone. This is Professor Mohammed Farghal, and this is my third lecture titled Translation Between Theory and Practice. In fact, I was planning to talk about morphology today, since last time I talked about phonetics and phonology, but because of the many comments I have received and the fact that more people around here are interested in translation, I have changed my mind. So today I'll give a general lecture on translation studies. I'll skip talking about the importance of translation because simply this doesn't go beyond talking about the obvious. And I'm not that much interested in the obvious. It's only enough to look at a relatively small continent like Europe to discover the importance of translation, where tens of modern languages are spoken. So you can imagine this continent without the business of translation. The flow of information, media, flow of knowledge. There will be no way for the different nations there with their national languages to interact with each other. If we look at ourselves here in this area, we are much more privileged. Why is that? Because we have standard Arabic as a lingua franca, covering the area from the Atlantic Ocean to the Arab Gulf, or probably more accurately, from the water to the petrodolars, and from the Turkish borders to the Sudan. We only have one language in which material from other languages is translated. In this lecture, I'll be looking first at the approaches we find in translation studies. Then I'll be looking at equivalence and context, both the macro context and the micro context in translation studies. Then I'll be moving on to talk about translation as a question of relevance and translation as an act of communication. And finally, I'll be looking at translation as a multi-stage process, both from a pedagogical perspective and from professional perspective. So let's first look at approaches to translation studies. And the most common approach is the textual approach. And this simply relates to studying translation material or textual data in order to discover norms. So instead of prescribing norms, it's more interesting to look at existing translations and detect norms. And this is parallel or similar to the distinction between prescriptive linguistics and descriptive linguistics. So we don't want to prescribe rules in translation studies. Translation activity is supposed to be based on translation norms, and these norms exist in actual translations on the market. So this approach follows the methodology of looking at textual data, corpuses, parallel corpuses, both in the target language and in the source language, in order to see how things should be done. In other words, in order to find norms and tendencies and contribute to improving the practice of translation activity. This is probably most clearly pronounced by Gideon Turi in his book titled Descriptive Translation Studies, where the focus is on critiquing existing translations and discovering norms in translation practice. The second approach is the cultural approach, which was termed the cultural turn, simply because translation theorists and linguists are more interested in material coming from other cultures. So it's not only the Anglo-American culture that is the focus. There are other marginal cultures which should come into play. So it's not only Eurocentric kind of features that have to be highlighted. Traditionally, most of translation activity was done out of English into other marginal languages. Now there are more and more translations coming from other languages into English, and there is much more awareness of other cultures, marginal cultures. For example, if we look at the pair that is relevant in this area, English and Arabic, translation between English and Arabic, we can see that there are more and more works from Arabic translated into English. And we also find more and more awareness of transferring cultural features from the Arabic cultures or features from the Arabic cultures into English translations. If you look at the translations of Najib Mahfouz, you look at the translations of Abdurrahman Munif, you find lots of cultural features translated as are or transferred as are into English. Sometimes the translator goes a bit too far. Peter Ferox, for example, translated the Arabic proverb العين بصيرة واليد قصيرة into the sight is far but the hand is short. You can imagine how hard going this would be for an native speaker of average intelligence. If, all right, the context might not help that much, all right, it would help, in fact, someone who's highly educated, someone whose IQ is very high, to figure out what's meant by this. The sight is far, but the hand is short. Okay, do we want to go this far? The answer may be no. Why? Because the translator is not there in order to make life difficult for the reader, for the average educated reader. The translator is supposed to be a facilitator rather than someone who complicates things. That's why I would not go this far. And sometimes, one has to be literal in order to transfer culture. But the literalness should be comprehensible to the target reader. If what's offered is double Dutch, something that cannot be interpreted, or it may be interpreted in wrong ways, we don't want that, because at the end of the day, translation is an act of communication. For example, if you look at Quran translations, you can find examples where the translation is far-fetched insofar as common sense is concerned. At one point in time, we did an experiment with a graduate student of mine. Now he's a professor, a doctor, Mohammed Masri. He's based in the States, I think, now, in order to see how native speakers of English respond to things like that. And we used the verse, وَإِن كُنتُمْ جُنُبًا فَطَّهَّرُوا. And we got wonders. All right, most of the interpreters, if not all of them, interpreted this in terms of spiritually, in spiritual terms, rather than in material terms. But we, as native speakers of Arabic, we look at this in terms of material terms. So if you have engaged in any kind of sexual activity, simply you have to go and bathe, go and have a bath. Nothing beyond that. But so translating this into something like, if you are filthy, purify yourself. Filthy. How could this be interpreted by a native speaker of English? Filthy could mean lots of things. Purify yourself. How do you purify yourself? By, for example, giving alms, by praying, by being nice to people. Okay. All of such things are, in fact, irrelevant, right? Regardless of what you do in terms of giving alms or being nice to others or whatever, this would not remove the necessity of having a bath in order to be ready for prayers. Okay, so when it comes to transferring culture, this is a sensitive issue. Sensitive issue simply because sometimes, if what's transferred culturally can be understood in terms of universal principles, yeah, this is a welcome move. Yes, that's what we need. All right, we need to enrich other cultures. How can other cultures, or how can culture enrich each other? They can enrich each other by simply transferring cultural features from one language into another. And that's how things probably evolve between different cultures. If we look, for example, at proverbs, we find the same proverb. We may find the same proverb in many different languages. It must have originated somewhere, but because of the interaction between these cultures, it has become common in many different languages. For example, the proverb, all the roads lead to Rome, is found in most European languages, and it's found in other languages belonging to other families. For example, it's found in Arabic. How come? And it would not mean the same thing, all right? At one point in time, Rome was, in fact, the center of the universe. But now, all right, when we say all the road or كل الطرق تؤدي إلى Roma, we don't mean Roma, as Roma is completely irrelevant, all right? So that the motive is completely different. Now, textual and cultural. If we look at this, the interaction between what's textual and what's cultural. Okay, the dividing line between them is so blurred, all right? It's like asking whether we can separate language from thought. Are they separable? To most people, including myself, the answer is no, they are not separable. They are interlooped. The same applies to language and culture. Can we separate language from culture? Or can we separate culture from language? apparently we cannot, they are not separable. They are intertwined. When you translate, you have to choose both language and culture. Okay, it's impossible for someone to to just separate language from culture and say that, look, I'm just translating language, or I'm just using language, no culture. We hardly find anything that is culturally neutral. This is the exception rather than the rule. That's why the distinction between language and culture is kind of superficial, all right? Why should we distinguish? Because they are interlocked. When we engage in translation activity, we have to worry both about language and culture because they are there, whether we like it or not. So talking about a culture of translation or something like that, I think this is very pretentious. This is pretentious. This really doesn't get us anywhere, simply because, okay, the two domains are interrelated. They are interlooped. One cannot be separated from the other. The next approach found in translation studies is the psycholinguistic approach, which is a very interesting approach, all right, which aims to look at what goes on in the mind of the translator when he puts pen to paper to translate. Okay, can we get to what goes on? All right, okay. There are some methodologies, all right. One very familiar methodology in translation studies is what they call Think-Aloud Protocols. You want translators to speak their ideas. So when they, all right, if you have some informants, some people translating, you want them to voice their ideas. Oh, I'm not quite happy with this word, so I should find something stronger or something more emotive. So if, all right, this kind of business in this methodology is supposed to be voiced, supposed to be spoken, and based on what translators do when they, based on what translators say when they translate, because this is assumed to reflect what goes on in their minds. And even there are more advanced methodologies based on eye movements and this kind of stuff. This is, all right, this is not familiar in the Arab world, all right? Just very few people who are doing their degrees in the West, for example, in the UK or in the United States, are interested in this stuff. And it's probably not our generation. It's the new generation, all right? So you might find some Arab students in the UK doing their PhDs on Think-Aloud Protocols. But how relevant this is to what we do in the Arab world, it's hardly relevant, but in elsewhere, for example, in the UK or in the United States, it's very relevant. All right, hopefully in the future, okay, there will be more interest generated within the Arab world in this approach to translational studies. The same applies to the sociological approach, which is a very interesting approach. But again, we are lagging behind insofar as this approach is concerned. And this approach looks at translation as a multifaceted game. It's not only the translator who's doing the job. There are many other people involved. So there are many other agents involved. So the game is, it's not a one-man show. Like Americans nowadays being the one-man show in the world, all right, trying to orchestrate the politics of the word, and hopefully this will change soon. But in translation, it's never a one-man show. We have commissioners, people who pay you. They commission translation, and you get paid for that as a translator. Do you do what you want, or you do what they want? Yeah, this is a good question. There are editors. Okay. After you finish your translation, the translation might be sent to some reviewer, and the reviewer would make changes. You may not approve the changes, but you have to, well, sometimes they are imposed on you by the publisher. So the publisher commissions a translation, you do the translation, then the publisher sends it to a reviewer. And he even does not go back to you. All right? He just takes what the reviewer says or what he has done as is. And this is what has happened with me. All right? In many cases, I was commissioned some translations. I did the translations. They were sent out to reviewers. The reviewers made some changes, but the publisher never came back to me. And they just published the translations. Now, once the translation is published, there are critics. We are part of the game. So what Purdue or the French sociologist calls capital. The capital is multifaceted here. So capital involves many agents in translation activity. Translators, commissioners, editors, copywriting, all these things are agents within the translation process. And so translation nowadays is, in addition to the other approaches, it's looked at as a social act involving many agents rather than one agent. The next approach is the pedagogical approach. And there are many people interested in this, how to teach translation. So translation has become so popular, especially in the Arab world, as an academic discipline. For example, you can hardly find a university in Jordan that does not offer a translation program, not only at the graduate level, but also at the BA level, which I believe is not the right thing to do. Why? Because translation activity requires mature people, maturity in terms of psychology and in terms of knowledge, not only psychology. So how would you expect people coming from high school to engage in translation? Some people who haven't been listening to news, who haven't been interested in the media, who've been interested only in WhatsApp and things like that. So all of a sudden they are in departments of translation, faced with the task of translating different text coming from different genres. I don't think so the right thing to offer translation programs at the BA level. Translation could be an important component of English departments. I think this is a very good idea, and which has been the way for a long time, and people were happy with that. But now, with the establishment of departments of translation at the BA level, I personally, there are many people who opposed me. I remember Professor Abdullah Shinab, okay, the late Professor Abdullah Shinab, rahmatullah alayhi, who was so keen on having a translation program at the BA level at Yarmouk University, and now it's a very popular program. But at the end of the day, we have to look at the graduates from that program. Is it a good idea to have translation programs at the BA level? Yeah, this is a controversial issue, but I think it's not a good idea simply because translation activity is a highly advanced exercise. It involves both language and culture. It's not enough for someone to be competent, assuming that competence is there, to be competent in two languages, which all of us know that this is not there. All right, you find students in departments of English and students in departments of translation who can hardly put two words together, or at least they are there to learn English rather than to translate into English. So translation departments are turned into language skills departments. Yeah, this is not the right way to do it, as simple as that. And finally, when it comes to approaches to translation studies, let me have a word about the technological approach, which is becoming more and more popular. There are many technological or technical aspects of translation which have found their way into technology. We are all aware of Mr. Google, Wikipedia, electronic dictionaries, encyclopedias. All these are found online these days. So translation now is much easier than what it used to be in the past. In the past, if you come across an allusion while translating a novel, you have to go to the library to look it up. And you may spend the whole week to no avail. Now, all right, you can get the answer in a fraction of a second by either going to Google or Wikipedia. So technology is a great aid to translators these days. Personally, all right, I have done many translations, by the way, and without technology, I wouldn't have even thought of doing a translation. How is that? Someone say, yeah, well, okay, but translation, all right, Google does not help. It does help if you know how to use Google properly. All right, let me give you an example, all right. You are stuck with a word, all right, you have chosen a word. And you are not that happy with it. Okay, Google will give you more options. And if you look at the options, oh, I don't know why I haven't called up this option. So it's all right, options, all right. When instead of being stuck with one or two options, Google might give you 15 options. And there you realize that, okay, there are more appropriate terms to use. Allusions, if you come across an allusion, someone alluding to a movie, and you're not familiar with that movie, the allusion is there for some purpose. There is a theme. But the theme, instead of expressing the theme lexically, the way we ordinarily do it, all right, that motive is expressed by making an allusion to some act or some character in a movie. What you have to do is just Google that allusion and you'll get an answer. Now there you have to what? You have to opt for something. that reflects the motive. Okay. These approaches, as you can see, cover all aspects of translation studies. Translation studies is, to me at least, a derived kind of discipline. It's part of applied linguistics. We have to recognize this fact. Now, how far it goes depends on the infrastructure of translation activity in a country. For example, the infrastructure here in the Arab world is quite modest. Okay, just we are content with looking at translation from a textual and cultural perspective, and to some extent from a pedagogical perspective, simply because the teaching of translation is quite popular these days and people want to know how to teach translation. But if we look at the other approaches, the psycholinguistic approach, the technological approach, the sociological approach, we are lagging behind. And in fact, it's a matter of relevance, how relevant these approaches are to us. So far, the infrastructure, for example, does not support the psycholinguistic approach. All right. Why? Because you need to have some infrastructure in order to scientifically study what goes on in the mind of the translator when he translates. But when it comes to the textual approach, you don't need an infrastructure, do you? All right, just look at existing translations and you can collect your textual data. This is the first part of my lecture. Now I move on to the question of equivalence and context in translation. How do we approach a text? If we are to translate a text, how do we approach it? What is it possible to have equivalence in the first place? To me, equivalence is, all right, translation equivalence is a kind of metaphor rather than an actual kind of thing, simply because it's impossible to have equivalence between X and Y. Once you change X into Y, Y must be different somehow. So there must be some translation loss or some translation gain. We have to either lose or gain when we translate. This is a reality. Something there, like it or not. So equivalence is a kind of metaphor. Instead of equivalence, I would prefer the term resemblance. Okay, translation resemblance rather than translation equivalence. But for convenience, of course, we use the term equivalence. But one should be aware of the fact that equivalence is out of the question, is impossible interlingually when you translate from one language into other. And it's also out of the question intralingually, in intralingual translation. When you are translating in the same language what you're saying, none of us can make himself 100% understood. I cannot claim that. If I did, then I would be lying. Simply because a word might escape me. Sometimes I may not be able to attack a concept properly. Sometimes I may be talking over the head of my listeners. So it's impossible. All right, it's impossible for this to happen. Total communication is out of the question. And this is more so when it comes to total translation, because in total communication, we are dealing with the same language. In interlingual communication, we are dealing with two languages. So total translation is even more impossible because it's one more step removed from the source language. If we look at translation studies and translation theories these days, we find many buzz dichotomies, very familiar dichotomies. And if we look closely at these dichotomies, okay, for example, someone authors a book about translation studies, and he wants to inject it with his own ideas. So at the end of the day, he comes up with some dichotomy. Semantic versus communicative translation. Newmark. All right. So if you ask someone, what do you remember Newmark, Peter Newmark for? And the answer must be semantic versus communicative translation. What do you remember Julian House for? And the answer for someone who has read Julian House, the answer would be overt versus covert translation. What about Nida, Eugene Nida? What do you remember him for? Formal versus dynamic equivalence or functional equivalence. Catford. What about Catford? Formal versus textual equivalence. All these dichotomies and much older ones, if we go back to the age of the Romans, through medieval Arabs and Chinese, up to now, we find people talking basically about the same dichotomy, word for word or sense for sense. Form versus content. Can we distinguish between, for example, semantic translation and documentary translation? Or communicative translation and instrumental translation? Or direct, for example, semantic translation and direct translation? They are the same. It's true that they belong to different authors, but when we talk about, for example, Gatt talking relevance theory, talking about direct translation versus indirect translation. Does he mean something different from semantic translation versus communicative translation, or documentary translation versus instrumental translation, or formal translation versus functional translation? In fact, all of these reflect the same idea. Do we communicatize meaning or semanticize meaning in translation activity? Communicatizing meaning simply means moving in the direction of target language norms. Semanticizing meaning simply means moving in the direction of target language, moving in the direction of source language norms. Gideon Toury, in his descriptive translation studies, also came up with a very nice dichotomy, but it's not different from other dichotomies. Acceptable translation versus adequate translation. Acceptability versus adequacy of translation. It's basically the same thing. It's much more contrastive, it's much more constructive to look at translation as involving both. In fact, translation cannot exist in a pure form. It's impossible for a translation to be 100% communicative or 100% semantic. It's true that the translator or the publisher might dictate that the translation be more semantic than communicative or more communicative than semantic. This is quite possible. So it's a matter of focus. So the translator at the end of the day should come to, assuming that he's translating a work of art or something that is quite serious, nothing, all right, we're not talking about something that's written for general purposes, where, all right, information only is relevant. But we're talking about something more serious, more artistic. Do we approach it? We have to approach it with a general strategy. For example, assuming that you want to translate a novel, you have to adopt a general kind of strategy. Either you should, all right, be biased to semantic translation or communicative translation. And this should reflect in your translation. But it's impossible for your translation to be purely semantic or purely communicative, or what Venuti refers to as domestication versus foreignization. Domestication, when you domesticate, you follow target language norms. When you foreignize, you follow source language norms. That's a matter of orientation. For Venuti, all right, Venuti is before being a translator, he's a literary critic, so he's more sensitive when it comes to transferring cultural things. That's why he wants people to foreignize, get cultures closer to each other. How? Through translation, foreignizing things. But can you foreignize a text 100%? I think Venuti himself would say, no, it's impossible. There must be some junctures at which you have to domesticate rather than foreignize. Otherwise, translation would lose its identity as an act of communication. You don't want to go as far as and what your right hand owns. وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ. Okay. We know what this means in Arabic. But what about the native speaker of English? Does this make sense to him? You do. So this is foreignizing, right? Say, and many Quran translators have opted for that. But have they done the right thing by translating this into and what your right hand owns? How much sense would this make to someone with average intelligence, even someone who's highly intelligent? Okay, so foreignization has its limits. Domestication also has its limits. That's why we do not, all right, we do not claim, or someone should not claim, that translation can exist in a pure form. All right, a translation that's 100% domesticated, or a translation that's 100% foreignized. This is short-sighted, to me at least. That's why these dichotomies are supposed to complement each other, but they complement each other within the idea of focus. This is similar to the two main functions of language, the referential function and the emphatic function. There must be some focus. And the focus can either be domestication or foreignization. But there is always a dose of the counterpart. So the question of equivalence is rather tricky. in translational studies. To me, and you find this in my publications, I look at equivalence as involving two poles. We have two poles. We have form and we have content. But instead of calling this form and content, I call, all right, we have formal equivalence and functional equivalence, which this comes from the literature. This is not my own creation. To me, these two types of equivalence are mediated by something that's more down to earth. That is ideation equivalence. Rendering the idea apart from the form, the formal features, and apart from the function. Note that the function here refers to something that is found in the target language that performs the same function, but it does not follow the same kind of form. Formal equivalence refers to the fact that one can offer formal equivalence simply because it, all right, in most cases, it can be interpreted in terms of universal principles, simply because we are all humans and we live on the same planet, so we share lots of ideas. And it is a nice thing to introduce new ideas embracing different forms between languages. This is a nice thing. Functional equivalence rather moves in the direction of the target language culture in order to find something that is equivalent functionally, despite the fact that it sails away from the lexicalization of the motive in the source language. Now, in between, according to me, we have some kind of equivalence that mediates between the two. That is ideational equivalence. Let me just give you one example. Here, this is a concocted example, but it's very likely that you come across examples like that, especially in argumentative discourse, rather than in expository or informative discourse. Okay, if this is the text, من المؤسف أن قرارات مجلس الأمن بخصوص القضية الفلسطينية لم تجد طريقها إلى التطبيق وبقيت حبرا على ورق طوال السنين الماضية. All right, this text, all right, assuming that you want to translate it into English, then you have to recognize the fact that, okay, there are some idiomatic expressions there. And if we go back to what I said in the first lecture, if you have listened to it, okay, we have the open principle and we have the idiom principle. And in this text embraces both. All right, this means that the text fluctuates from the open principle to the idiom principle. So we have two idiomatic expressions here. We have حبرا على ورق and we have وجدت أو لم تجد طريقها إلى. Okay, how do we approach this in actual translation activity? Okay, formal equivalence. Formal equivalence might be possible. For example, لم تجد طريقها إلى التطبيق. All right. Here we have formal equivalence and we have functional equivalence at the same time. Okay, this means that the two languages lexicalize this idiomatic expression more or less in the same way, have not found their way into implementation. لم تجد طريقها إلى التطبيق. Okay, so here this is optimal translation. Now, if we move on to the second idiomatic, حبرا على ورق. حبرا على ورق. Okay. Now, formal equivalence does not work. And they remain ink on water. Sorry, they remain ink on paper. Ink on paper does not mean a lot, all right? Okay, maybe someone whose IQ is so high might be able to figure out what's meant by ink on paper. A creative translator might what? If, for example, you want to call up something that involves ink, which is quite possible in English and Arabic, but it is not, all right? It does not lexicalize the way it is the way it lexicalizes here. But they are not where the ink they are written in. ولكنها لا تستحق الحبر الذي كتبت به. Okay, now, okay, this, all right, if you want to capture part of the image, all right, so it's quite there. Assuming that neither of these are accessible to the translator, what's he supposed to do? Should he, what, lock himself away in a room and start crying? And the answer is no, all right. Why? Because we have other options. Okay, and that's where ideation equivalence comes into play, all right? Where we can be more down to earth. So instead of saying, لم تجد طريقة إلى التنفيذ, assuming that someone is not familiar with that. The translator is not, all right, some students may not be familiar with this idiomatic expression or something that corresponds to حبر على ورق, dead letter, for example. All right, but all right, ideation equivalence here comes to the rescue of the translator by using something like ineffective, have not been implemented, have not been activated. All right, there are other options. Okay, form is variable, relatively variable, all right? So form, to me, enjoys a high level of variability. This contrasts with content. Content enjoys a high degree of constancy. And translators are interested in meaning. At the end of the day, translation is a transfer of meaning from one language into another. And depending on the type of text we are translating, okay, the importance of form and content fluctuates. If you are translating something from the media, for example, a news report, all right, why do you bother about form? Hardly, if ever, all right, you are only interested in the information. You want to relay the information. If you are translating an argumentative text, for an editorial, you are more worried about form there. Why? Because you want to what? You want to capture the tone. You want to be convincing, persuasive. This becomes more complicated if you are translating a poem, for example, where form and function become interlocked. Okay, you have to worry as much about form as content. Why? Because if you remove the form, okay, the fact that you have a poem evaporates, no longer there. That's why, right, most people prefer translating verse into verse rather than verse into prose. Why? Because when you translate verse into prose, you just relay the meaning. But when you translate it into verse, you capture both meaning and form. But you have to lose. All right, so there, all right. And sometimes you have to gain. Sometimes you gain rather than lose. When Fitzgerald translated رباعيات الخيام, I think he gained rather than lost. He became so popular, despite the fact that, all right, he well, he thought lowly of what he translated. He thought that he was translating a poet that did not deserve to be translated, but his translation turned out to be what? A classic. Probably because he was translating from Persian, a marginal language, into a lingua franca, English. Would it have been the same way if he was translating from Greek into English? I doubt it. So he wouldn't brag what he has bragged, or even he was referring to, okay, to the Persian poet as someone who's in need of a little art to shape him. Okay, so in other words, I'm translating someone who's nobody, but look, my translation has turned him into something important. What about context? In translation, we have a macro context and we have a micro context, and they are equally important. All right, so at the end of the day, you have to approach a translation with some strategy. The macro context. The macro context, we have some key players in translation activity. We have the author. We have the text. And we have the audience. So, and this can be viewed as three components placed on a triangle. At the top of the triangle, you have the author. At the base of the triangle, you have text and audience. So we have three variables here, three components. Author at the top, then we have text and audience. What about the translator? The translator is a key agent here, and it can be not only the translator, but the commissioner. But let's say that it's the translator. So the translator is supposed to be placed in the center of the triangle. He is a key agent in this process. And so the translator has to examine his priorities. Is the text the first priority, or is the audience the first priority? What about the author? The author is, for example, does he have to worry about the author? In most cases, he does, especially when it comes to translating literature. For example, someone translating Nizar Qabbani and Mahmoud Darwish, and another translating Mahmoud Darwish, all right? You cannot translate Nizar Qabbani the way you translate Mahmoud Darwish. The delicacy of Nizar Qabbani should reflect itself in your translation. The fury of Mahmoud Darwish should be reflected in your translation. Nizar Qabbani is capable of turning something that is minus emotive into something that is highly emotive. When he said, Beirut, Ya unthaya min bayni malayin al-nisa. Untha. He has turned the word untha into something highly emotive. The translator, how about the translator? Could he translate this into female? That would be short-sighted. Why? Because female is minus emotive in English. So formal equivalence does not work here, despite the fact that you are translating poetry. Notice that formal equivalence is a priority when it comes to translating poetry, literature in general and poetry in particular. But here in this case, formal equivalence does not work. So it would be so short-sighted for the translator to say, Beirut, oh my female from among millions of women. This would be a flat translation that's lacking common sense. Why? Because female is minus emotive. So you should translate it into something like my love, my beloved, my lady, something that is plus emotive. Okay, now, okay, very quickly, let me, okay, no, but before that, all right, so this is the macro context. The macro context would take into account three components. Author, all right, author at the top of the triangle. At the base of the triangle, we have text and audience. Then in the center of the triangle, we have the translator. What about micro context? The micro context. At the end of the day, you should be looking at what? At some textual material, some material you are translating, like the text I have just offered. So you have to look at the context, the micro context, in order to decide what a word means. And the micro context can be either psychological or physical or linguistic. The linguistic context simply refers to the surrounding text, which determines what a word means. And this goes without saying, for example, simply because most words in language are ambiguous. The word run, for example. If you look it up in a good dictionary, you might find more than 150 different meanings of the word run. So you'll have to look at the surrounding context in order to figure out what run means. But also you'll have to look at the psychological as well as the physical context. The physical context. What do we mean by it? Well, it depends where you are. Are you at the church or are you in the marketplace? This makes a lot of difference. If, for example, you come across a sign reading fall baby sale, do you expect that store to be selling babies? So would you go into there in order to buy a baby? Of course not. All right. Why? Because so you have to neutralize the linguistic context and activate both the psychological context as well as the physical context. The psychological context. All right. Nowadays, we don't buy and sell babies, do we? It used to be the case in the United States, but not in present day world. The physical context, you are in the marketplace. So yeah, things are both and sold there, that's true. But what you can buy there is definitely not babies. Something must be something else. Okay, so you have to consult, all right, when you translate, you have to not lose sight of both the macro context and the micro context. So equivalence can be discussed theoretically, and one can give numerous examples to say that, look, I can prove that there are different types of equivalence, but at the end of the day, equivalence is tied to context. It's the context that determines what the equivalent is, rather than anything else. Or it's true that sometimes we engage in looking at expressions out of context. Yeah, which is a nice exercise. But things are different within connected discourse. Within connected discourse, we'll have to look at both the macro context as well as the micro context in order to come up with something that is convincing. Okay, now let's move on to looking at translation as what, an act of, or a question of relevance, as well as a question of communication, or an act of communication. It is, yeah, so far I have shown that translation at the end of the day is an act of communication. That's what the translator should worry about. Once he's done with his translation, he should probably look away himself in a room and examine his translation and see whether it functions as an act of communication or not. If at one juncture or another it does not, then he should rethink what he has done. Translation is a question of relevance. So at the end of the day, you translate what's relevant. You don't worry about things that are not relevant in the target language. الفاضل الدكتور محمد فرغل. Assuming that you come across this in a text you are translating, you have to worry about الفاضل. I'm far from being virtuous. Okay, الفاضل says this is not relevant when you are translating into English. Or حامل حرمين الشريفين, and this stuff, all right, or فلان أدام الله ظله, or ذهب إلى الحمام أجلك الله, أجلك الله, all right, أجلك الله here is not relevant. Why? Simply because in the target culture, right, going to the bathroom there's nothing taboo about going to the bathroom. But in the Arab culture, when you buy shoes, when you buy a donkey, when you go to the bathroom, all right, you have to euphemize. You have to use a euphemistic expression in order to function socially appropriate. Okay, finally, let me move on to translation as a multi-stage process. I haven't timed myself, so I don't know how much time I have been talking, all right? But let me, okay, attack this topic, then bring this lecture to a close. From a pedagogical perspective, for those who teach translation, all right, they worry about how to teach translation. Or is translation a one-stage process, or is it a multi-stage process? To me, it's a multi-stage process. It's a three-stage process insofar as the pedagogy of translation is concerned. We have pre-translation, we have translation, and we have post-translation. Pre-translation involves reading for translation purposes. Okay, this is different from pleasure reading. It's different from reading for other purposes. Reading for translation purposes involves making notes. You make notes to yourself while reading. You want to translate a text, so you want to read it before you translate it. So you have to make notes to yourself. You have to highlight problematic areas, probably give some answers to some problems in order not to forget them. So you read for translation purposes. This involves making notes. This is called note making. Then once you have read the text and have made the notes while reading it, you can move on to the second stage. That is translate. That is the actual translation. That's when you put pen to paper to start your translation. And there will be a time when you are finished with your translation. When you are finished with your translation, I think it's a good idea to put it away and come back to it later on to engage in the stage of post-translating. Within the classroom, this is probably not available, but if you, for example, if you divide your class into groups, assuming that you have 20 students in your class and you have given them a text to translate, you can divide your class into groups of 5, and first you have them work on the first stage, reading. All right, the members of the group come together and they read the text for translation purposes. They highlight problematic areas in the text. Then once they are finished, they start translating the text and getting feedback from each other. And finally, the post-translation, all right, it could be, well, could be within the same group or could be offered to the whole group. All right, if you want to, for example, if you want to put part of that translation on the board and discuss it, then you would be engaging in post-translating, assuming that you have good students, of course, good students in your class, and not those who are there to learn English or learn Arabic, but rather who are there to engage in transferring between English and Arabic. So the skill of transfer is the most important thing in translation activity, the ability to transfer between two languages. It's not only language competence, assuming that language competence is there, but language competence in the two languages does not guarantee good translation activity. It is the ability to transfer between the two languages. So you would be engaging in post-editing on the board. All right, so for example, you might change some structure, some lexical items, the tone, you might not like the tone. If it's an argumentative text, you want to make it more effective, something like this. Now, professionally, this is more complicated. It involves the 3 stages, but there are more stages to worry about. Okay, you have to put away your translation for a while and come back to it probably more than once, many times. So the post-translating process might involve the same translator a couple of times or several times. It's a good idea to what? To have someone else read your translation. And that is professionally, that's what happens. If you are commissioning a translator, your translation would be sent out to a reviewer. You have to make sure that things are done properly. The post-editing, when it comes to the profession of translation, is multifaceted. Your translation might come out as a disaster, not in terms of language competence, but in terms of many other things. For example, you might be attacked by critics, assuming that we have critics here on the Arab scene, which is hardly available. All right, so nobody would. You translate, you put your translation in the market, but nobody reads it. And for those who read it, they would not even give feedback about it. I think more than a month ago, probably 2 months ago, I put a post on Facebook, and I was referring to one of my translations of a very important American author in science fiction, McCarthy. And okay, the novel started the road, and it seemed that many people were interested. So I received so many emails from people asking me to send them my translation. And the novel is so popular. It has been turned into a movie. And it has been screened on many Arabic channels. And but on the post I said I wanted some feedback on my translation, and believe it or not, I sent it to more than, I don't want to exaggerate, but definitely more than 50 people. But I have received no feedback whatsoever. Even if you look at, all right, I checked the internet, and I hardly found anything that makes sense about it. All right, some newspaper reporting on that translation, and just copying and pasting from my introduction to the translation, nothing beyond that. I guess I found 1 or 2 reviews that made sense. All right, the rest were just, it's a big shame. Oh, All right, I think I've been talking too much. Thank you very much. Goodbye.